I started to think that I needed to leave my soul on the sidelines if I wanted to be welcomed anywhere. And for me, that hit really hard and affected me very deeply because it sort of began my lifelong journey of trying to find the balance between boundaries and belonging.
Welcome to the Unquiet Sisterhood, a place where we can talk about real life, work, love, and more from a feminist perspective. I'm Jen Pavich, your host, and now let's dive right in. Hey there, and welcome to the second episode of the Unquiet Sisterhood podcast. I'm really excited to bring you this conversation with Toronto-based coach Brigid Dineen. In many ways, this is kind of a continuation of a conversation that Brigid and I started on her podcast last year, and I will put the link to that in the show notes. A little bit about Brigid before we get started. So she's known for her deep empathy and grounded approach to personal growth. Brigid's a resilience coach for strong women, and she's been teaching, coaching, and supporting women for over a decade as they learn to put themselves on the priority list. Brigid believes in a world where well-being comes first, and she's on a mission to help women reclaim their time, energy, and peace of mind so that they can make a meaningful contribution to the world while also feeling fulfilled. As the creator of Breathing Room and Mindfulness for Busy People, she provides practical tools and strategies for self-care to help you reclaim your time, energy, and peace of mind. And she also hosts the podcast, Guts and Grace, How to Create Space for Yourself in a World That Would Rather You Stayed Small. So let's get to it. Thanks so much for joining me today, Brigid. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Likewise, I am stoked to be here.
And I know we've talked before on your podcast, and I'm going to put that in the show notes, too, so people can go back and listen to it. But I want to talk about some of the things that I've seen you posting online that have gotten me really excited and really curious. But first, I'd like to just kind of start out the way that I start out with everybody, which is to ask you, what's kind of calling you right now? Like, what's making you curious or kind of unquiet or uncomfortable, or you find yourself thinking about at odd times?
This is such a good question. And I love it because, of course, like sitting and pondering it, like it gets uncomfortable. It's like, let me consider all of the things that are making me uncomfortable right now, or unquiet, as you say. And I think this is not a new thing for me, but it's one that's kind of coming up in new ways, given the political landscape in the West right now, and probably really all over the world. I'm really affected by and curious about how to move forward from this place where I notice, and it breaks my heart, and I say this very humbly because I know that it's a complex issue, and I kind of understand the nuance, and I understand the self-preservation aspects of it. But when I see women playing along with the patriarchy, like my heart is heavy even now as I say it. It's something that I was introduced to from a pretty young age, and it shocked the hell out of me when I first came upon it. And it happened in the context of, me voicing issues that I had been, like challenges that I had been confronted with, only to feel betrayed by the women to whom I went for help.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So for me,
that's willing to say more about that a little bit?
Yeah, I can say a little bit
what that looks like. Yeah,
I can say a little bit more about that. So one of the, for instances, is like way back in the day, I dealt with a lot of workplace harassment, like a stupid amount. And I was super shocked by it because I was very type A, and I did my darndest and showed up really educated and prepared and thought that everything would be groovy because I'm prepared and smart and willing to work
hard. Checked all the boxes.
I checked the boxes. And then I was like, what is this crap of like people saying this shit to me at work? Like as if I'm in the workplace and I have to deal with this nonsense. And like, I won't get into all the details about that, but suffice to say, there was like a squillion examples, some of which got to the point that I was like, okay, enough is enough. And I've got to tell HR about it. And when I reported these issues to HR, I mean, they told me the things they were supposed to tell me, but I was pretty well connected and people talk at work. So then I heard in the aftermath how it was actually handled. And it turns out that like jokes were cracked and, you know, it was really not taken seriously and that sort of thing. So
Wow.
I was just
suddenly you find yourself thrown under the bus is this uptight woman that has no sense of humor and kind of can't deal with, you know.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so, and that was supposed to be the safe place, right? That was supposed to, like, you follow the rules.
That feels like a huge violation.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I feel like I've got lots of examples of stuff like that happening in my life, but like where you go to somebody and you share the struggle that is in many ways uniquely a woman's struggle, thinking that you'll find empathy and maybe, you know, somebody who can relate and therefore be on your side and that sort of thing. But meanwhile, like we've all sort of been conditioned, like, and not even conditioning, like we keep ourselves safe, right? And so for centuries, the way that women have kept ourselves safe is by not rocking the boat and playing along, right?
Yeah.
So I get that, like I get it deeply. But we're kind of we're in a new phase of history now where many of us do have the ability to rock the boat to a certain extent without fear of the level of repercussion that once upon a time would have been automatic. So there's like this sense of more relative safety for many of us who might be willing to disrupt to whatever extent we feel comfortable with. And it really makes me feel unquiet.
Because there is this piece of like the Me Too movement is kind of all about safety in numbers.
Yes.
And invisibility.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I feel like I don't have answers. If that's a question I have basically right now. It's like, so what do we do with this?
I'm so glad you brought this up because this is actually something that I've been kind of rumbling with as well. Almost also more from the angle of looking at, you know, women and white supremacy and kind of, you know, this idea of the fact of the matter is white women contribute to white supremacy hugely. And, you know, even sometimes white women who call themselves feminists. And, you know, what I've been looking at is, so, you know, Jessica Valenti wrote a piece on Medium. It's probably been like a week or two now about how we need to stop trying to convert the women that voted for Trump because they're kind of like a lost cause. And my impulse was to push back on that, but also to like kind of talk about how we're not going to convert anybody by just debating them. The fact of the matter is women who are complicit in the patriarchy do so, like you just said, for their own safety. And also because they've been conditioned to believe that their only value lies in being valued by white men.
I realize this is a podcast. I'm nodding away right now.
But, you know,
I'm just silently nodding.
The only way to do this is to help white women who voted for Trump. And I say this with like kind of like, oh, fucking really? In my voice, because really? But like, is to help white women confront their own internalized oppression.
Yeah.
Like,
and
the
that's what you and I
only way to like convince white women to stop oppressing other people is to have them confront their own internalized oppression.
Yeah.
And that takes a great deal of compassion. And it really, really, you know, kind of needles at my sense of social justice for that to be a focus.
Yeah, I really get that. And the internalized oppression piece, you know, is huge. That's what you and I talked about on my podcast too. And and so that's why it's like, on the one hand, I get it. Like, I get why you can get stuck there. And then on the other hand, for like, it's really not enough.
You know? I know. And to like think about things that way on a daily basis, when I see, you know, some white women posting something on Facebook or calling the police on a Black person for living their life.
Yes.
And my instant response is like, oh, hell no,
Absolutely.
but it is, I feel like, the work of doing this is, none of it's easy work, right? Like if it was easy, we would have fixed it already.
Absolutely.
Like it's hard shit, and it's doing shit that doesn't feel fair or like where the attention should be, but it's still necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not sure if this was actually in the article or if I happened to hear this point elsewhere, like around the same time as reading the article that you just talked about. But someone, and I can't attribute it properly because I don't remember at all where I came across it. But somebody said something about, when I'm debating somebody who doesn't share my values, it's not actually to try to convince them of anything. It's for the people that are watching. Meaning, if I'm at the dining room table and I've got like a racist uncle, and even though it's been 20 years and I know he's not going to change his mind and whatever, if I choose to continue to engage and if I continue to say something and not just let it slide, then my nieces and nephews at the table will understand that stuff doesn't just slide.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, and that's so important. And I think it's,
and I've totally done that too.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it is more about the audience than the person on the other side of it.
Yeah. So it might be a nonlinear thing where, these conversations are worth having, but I think it's different to talk about this phenomenon versus actually engaging with people who, who maybe now are complicit with the patriarchy. And obviously there has to be an interest to move forward. First of all, if there isn't, then engaging like one-on-one for the purpose of transformation isn't going to get you anywhere.
I think you have to start with an awareness, right? Because I think that there's so much unconscious complicity that happens, coming from a place of not having a lot of self-awareness and kind of, coming from this place of internalized oppression is largely unconscious, right?
Absolutely.
But when we're all conditioned to sort of believe underneath that everybody but, the white men in power has to fight for the scraps, and we fight for the scraps, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so true. It's so true. This shit runs so deep, like there are no easy answers, but I'm feeling like even just as we're having this little conversation about it, it's like I have this sense of spaciousness kind of opening up where it's like, I need to take care of myself well enough that I can continue to show up for those tough conversations, that I can continue to opt in. And so that I can really just be myself in those conversations. Like it's a lot of work to become untriggered by it so that you have the capacity to continue the conversation. And, for me, that's my work is like, how do I engage in my own practices in a way that helps me to be able to come back to a sense of calm, even when some nonsense is going down, so that I can engage.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
and it is, too, like there's a vulnerability piece in there as well. It's vulnerable to put yourself, in that position of kind of having these difficult conversations. And it's funny, like what you mentioned about having that conversation for the people who are listening. That gets me curious. And I know this isn't something that we necessarily smile upon in the personal growth industry, but I almost think when I think about, women who are maybe complicit with the patriarchy and don't really realize it, like what are the sort of side doors into the process? What are the kind of ways that, we might be able to develop some more self-awareness, like under the radar?
Yeah, that's a good question, and one definitely worth kind of pondering.
Yeah.
I'll let that one percolate.
I think I will too. Okay, so let's talk about some of the stuff you've been posting because I'm super excited about it.
Let's do it.
So you've been posting a lot about kind of the role that power and boundaries play for women. And so that got me curious about a million things. But the first one was kind of like, how has that showed up in your own life? And what's that been like?
Where to begin? So in so many ways, Jen, so many ways. So when I think about this theme in general, and I kind of let myself go back into my childhood, like I'm I was in the fortunate position of like feeling really powerful as a girl. And the specific things that helped me to feel that way were the fact that I was put into sports where typically it was boys. So I was one of two girls in our local house league, hockey league.
Wow.
And I played golf from a young age too. Speaking of privilege, so I played golf, and I like talk about the only girl very often. Even today, if I'm playing golf, I'll show up and I'm like, just me.
It's funny that you say that about golf over hockey. And can I just say, I used to manage a preteen girls hockey team.
Girls
playing hockey, best thing ever.
Oh, so fun. Yeah. Yeah. So eventually I did join, like in high school, I was on the girls hockey team, but when I was a kid, it was ringette if you were a girl, and I didn't want to play ringette. I wanted to play hockey. I wanted to be in the NHL.
Yeah.
So
well, it's such an empowering thing for girls. I feel like almost more than any other sport. Like it's really like kind of a.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I grew up feeling like I can hang, and more than I can hang with the boys, like I can beat them. Bring it on. You know what I mean?
That's awesome.
And so that was so cool. That was amazing in terms of my childhood. Like I was raised to believe that I could absolutely do anything that a guy could do. And then I turned into like a teenager and then a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And the rules changed. I started to notice that I wasn't always invited, and maybe places where I never would have thought that I needed an invitation because I had always been in those spaces when I was younger. All of a sudden it's like, oh no, but you're a girl. And there are rules that go along with that. And so it sort of became clear that if I wanted to still be invited at all, I better damn well understand the rules and not push my luck.
Wow.
So, and that wasn't specifically in the context of those sports because, I mean, golf is an individual thing. So I continued to play golf. And for hockey, as I mentioned, I was on the girls hockey team. So that was cool. But then like in social spaces, like I'm also a singer-songwriter, and like in high school, like the boys started forming bands. And I was like, I can sing, I can play the guitar. And I was literally told to my face, like, you're never going to be in this band. Like you already beat me at math and this and that in school, and no way, this is my thing.
Wow.
So, it was like, oh, okay. So if I still want to hang out with these people or any people, I better reel it in. It was kind of like, it was this very slow, like I only see it looking back now. I didn't recognize it at the time, but I was slowly being taught that like, I better get a little smaller if I expect people to still like me. And if I expect to be part of any community.
Right.
It's like, you can't, like, don't shine so bright, And I was bullied for excelling at things as well. Bullied by girls primarily. So I kind of got it from both sides, the guys saying, no, you can't play over here. And then the girls shaming me and bullying me for being too good at stuff and for outshining
Well,
them.
and that's almost like just what you were talking about, right? Like the complicity with the patriarchy, right? Like women keep women in line with patriarchal ideals just as much as men do.
Yeah, very true. Very true. So it was almost like I started to think that I needed to leave my soul on the sidelines if I wanted to be welcomed anywhere.
Ooh.
And for me, that hit really hard and affected me very deeply because it sort of began my my lifelong journey of trying to find the balance between boundaries and belonging. It's like that's my jam. Like I want to feel a sense of belonging, but at the same time, I do not plan on taking any shit, and so to be taught that in order to be part of the community, you must take shit or you must not fully be yourself or what have you, like that really is a loss of self. And so I started kind of giving myself away piece by piece in order to not get bullied or
right.
like to still be able to hang out, whatever. And then basically, I mean, it's hard to have boundaries when you don't know who you are anymore. And really that's like the biggest boundary violation of all, like to give your essence away, to stop being who you are, to stop being yourself in order to fit in or be accepted.
Yeah, almost like you're denying your own identity.
Absolutely. And so, and how disempowering is that, right? I mean, that's
Right.
like, it's this slow drain of power, because I could feel my potency as a girl, like even now I'm very connected to that, even the physical sensation. Like I can go there,
Yeah.
I can go to that place really quickly of remembering what it was like to be a girl and to feel like I rock. Like I had girl power was like in my bones. But then it slowly leached out over the years, and it had everything to do with learning how to be a woman in this world. And so trying to fit in and trying to play along really did leave me feeling pretty powerless. But at the end of the day, frankly, I didn't want to fit into the patriarchy. So like I spent those teenage and young adult years sort of negotiating how to fit in. And then I was like, oh, F this noise. Like, I don't want to be part of this. Right. And so that's when the reclamation of power began. It was like, okay, so some boundaries have to be put in place here so that I can recover my sense of who I am, which looks like doing what I want to do, like remembering what brings me joy and using my resources, my time, my energy, my money to actually engage in the things that light me up. And so when I started
energizing too, right?
Yeah.
Like that gives you a different kind of energy to engage in creating those boundaries.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So that was sort of the work that was required in the first place to recover myself, like to get myself back. And it continues to be the work that allows me to be fully expressed in this world, in the work that I do and in the causes that I engage in. Because boundaries really have so much to do with how you are going to spend your energy, right? And as you said, it is energizing to do more of what we love. And I like to say energy is exponential. It's not just like I spent 20 minutes,
right,
doing XYZ. If I spend 20 minutes doing something that drains me, I could be wiped for the whole day. Whereas if I spend those 20 minutes doing something that lights me up, I might not want coffee for 2 days. You know what I mean?
Right.
So we can actually like get that sense of being wired and engaged and lit up simply by being intentional about what we choose to spend our energy on, so that it can expand and get even bigger. So yeah, power and boundaries are like, it's been a long road, and those are two themes that are really, really prevalent, like from a really young age, and continue to be kind of front and center now.
Yeah. And so what do you feel like our culture teaches women about like power and boundaries and specifically as women?
Yeah. Okay. So can I drop F-bombs?
Of course.
Okay. So here's the mind fuck. Ready? Our culture teaches women, you have all the power and freedom in the world. Right? They tell us that.
They tell us that.
Why simultaneously, subconsciously, gaslighting us and and telling us that women with power are bitches. Women with power are unlovable. They're cold and they're not invited.
Yes. Right? And women with boundaries, like boundaries just gets thrown around a lot. Like the word boundaries even, and the idea of what it is gets thrown around a lot. But I feel like we're also told women with boundaries are selfish.
Absolutely.
They're not giving the way that women are supposed to be.
Mm-hmm. And also they don't have a sense of humor because they're taking things too seriously. So where a woman is, honoring a boundary or defending a boundary, often it's like, oh, well, it was just a joke. And like, we know it wasn't just a joke. You know what I mean?
Right. It's really easy to say anything is just a joke.
Yeah, instead of actually having a real conversation about the elephant in the room, for sure. So the thing is, it's this double-edged thing where we're told one thing, the reality is something else, and so we're all confused. And the thing is, that's how power is being wielded in our culture, right? So in the midst of all that, like all of this is set against the backdrop of toxic power.
Yep.
So toxic power is being used to manipulate us into being so confused that we don't wield our own power. And we misunderstand what power is in the first place because we only see it represented in one way, which is gross. Like it's used to take advantage of people. It's power over people instead of just power. right? And like owning your own presence,
yeah,
responsible for yourself. Like that's what power is integrity, is, all of that good stuff. But because we've twisted it and it's been used in such a,
well, it's been used by the patriarchy as a power over, right? Like,
absolutely.
I mean, that's kind of the way things are done.
Yeah. So we don't have models, right? Like we don't have examples of what healthy power looks like. And so like you probably find this in your work with clients and in conversations with women in general, is if you just even ask a woman like what she thinks about power, a lot of women, like it might make their skin crawl. They might be like, oh, I don't want it.
Yeah.
I don't want power.
Well, and I think not only is it like viewed as a negative thing, like having power over someone, but I also think for a lot of women, it feels like taking on this huge responsibility that's beyond yourself. Or kind of taking on this huge, rather than just, no, it's really just taking responsibility for yourself and taking on, your own personal power is a different thing than kind of having, wielding some kind of other great power.
Yeah, it really is about staying in your own business, right? Because just as you were describing that, this idea of power and responsibility, it's like power is being responsible for yourself. When I think about what women are taught about responsibility, we're responsible for everyone and everything and all the people's feelings and
everyone's
all of that
happiness,
stuff. Like
everyone's sense of well-being. Yep.
Micromanage everyone else's shit. Like how disempowering is that as a lifestyle? Like that's what leaves women feeling drained and depleted. That's why a lot of my clients come to me, is because they're in that place of feeling so drained and overcommitted and resentful of responsibility. But it's because we've been taught to orient our responsibility elsewhere and to make it and to be responsible for things that are not actually truly our responsibility.
Right. And I think that the idea of power then comes to women that are already feeling overwhelmed is, oh my God, just one more thing for me to be responsible for.
Yeah.
It's funny. Like I think of the metaphor about staying in your lane. And I think, getting behind the wheel of a car is wielding a great power, right?
Yeah.
That's a huge responsibility. It's taking, your life in your hands, maybe other people's lives, that kind of thing. But it's like the same kind of idea of if you just stay in your own lane, it's easy to manage that power. It's kind of easy to, not look over and see what other people are doing or not feel like we have to take on what the other drivers on the road are doing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
So the other thing that I saw you post that got me really curious the other day is you put something about surrender. And that's something that we also hear a lot about in the personal growth world, how we're just supposed to, kind of surrender and let the universe bring us things and all of that kind of stuff. So, and what you posted, well, I'll let you talk about it. So you posted something about how that might not be the best idea for women that have trouble kind of taking ownership of their own power.
Yes, absolutely. So speaking of things with which I am rumbling, like I'm a professional coach in the personal development field and a yoga teacher. And I don't believe that we should be teaching everybody to surrender. So how's that for disrupting the culture?
Definitely.
So the reason that I say that, the reason that I think that surrender might not be your best next step is that if you've been oppressed, you're quite accustomed to surrendering your power, right?
Yeah.
And then spiritual development and personal development, especially when it's espoused by men and white men, will then tell you that you're supposed to surrender. Like that's your ego. Surrender your ego, and then you'll be free. Well, the problem is that you've already surrendered too much. You know what I mean? It's like if you are in a position, like we've described this phenomenon pretty well so far in our conversation, but this idea of, not living life on your terms and being overly responsible for everybody else. So you're just supposed to surrender to that reality, or surrender to the patriarchy and the fact that this is the way it is. And just learn to soothe yourself and be okay with it, like disconnect enough, be detached enough that you're unaffected by it. Well, that's a big load of bullshit, because that just perpetuates the same stuff. And when it comes,
and I think it's what we see women do all the time anyway, like when they're not in that, place of being able to do the personal work, that is where you go, right? Like you just deal with the overwhelm and kind of retreat into yourself.
Yeah.
And that's not a healthy place to be.
Yeah. It's like coming to that conclusion that I'm fine when really you're not fine. Right.
Yeah.
It feels similar to me, this idea of surrender from a woman's perspective anyway, through the lens with which I'm viewing the world in this particular situation, because I know obviously I don't speak for all women, but yeah, so it's like surrender has its place, absolutely, and I think that we need to have like a tighter lens on surrender. So surrender is useful because it's important to be with what is.
Yes.
That is very important, because that is where our power lies, is in the present moment. And so surrender for me, like it can be like a physiological thing, right? So if there's something about the system that I want to fight against, then I'm going to need to find a way to tap into a sense of resilience within myself. And if I'm feeling too hot, it helps me to have tools to be able to use in order to find a sense of calm, not because I shouldn't be angry, but because in order to actually be able to show up and engage and do anything productive, I'm going to have to be able to settle myself, right?
Right.
So, and that's one angle. I'm sure people have other approaches as well that involve just really leaning into your anger, and that could work too. I don't know.
I think we're seeing that a lot on like a really grand stage worldwide.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm also looking at the sustainability of it, right? So It's like our anger is there to inform us. Absolutely. Our anger tells us where our boundaries have been violated, where they need to be restored or honored or what have you. And then, again, I think that bit of surrender, it's like, when I think about surrender, it's like an internal experience. I'm surrendering by becoming present to my own emotional state. I am, what helps to bring me a sense of relief is being compassionate with myself instead of critical of myself. And so those forms of surrender resonate with me. But the idea of surrendering to another person, for instance, to me is definitely not healthy for people who have been abused or oppressed. And that's what a lot of spiritual and personal development schools of thought might espouse. And that's dangerous, in my opinion.
Yeah. And I also think it's almost like what you're describing is the difference between surrender and resignation. Mm-hmm. And surrender is internal, but, kind of resignation, I feel like has a more external effect, or a more external, it's more of an external thing to do. Like I'm going to kind of just, the phrase that keeps popping into my head is, it is what it is.
Right. So it's kind of like a numbing out and going through the motions sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think there can be power in that, and just looking at a situation or a relationship or a person and getting to that point of, okay, it is what it is, mm-hmm. But you can't stop there. Like there's like a second piece to that of, mm-hmm. If I'm in, for an example, an abusive relationship, and I kind of just say, this is what it is, and nothing that I'm doing is changing it, well, then that gives me a different place to start my decision for what comes next from.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rather than hanging on to the hope that things are just going to change on their own.
Mm-hmm.
If I, surrender or resign myself to the thought of, okay, this situation isn't changing on its own, I have to do something about it.
Yeah, for sure. And that actually brings up something that I think is really fundamental in this whole conversation, because there's absolutely a time for surrender, I believe, and then there's a time for tapping into your strength, right? And what it comes down to is safety, right?
Yes.
So surrender happens within the context of safety. That's when it's healthy. Mm-hmm. If it's not safe, don't surrender.
Yeah,
quite plainly,
exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
And so that's why for me, it's important to look at if you are engaging in like spiritual practice or personal development, and surrender is something that's being taught, I would be very attuned to the environment and how safety is being upheld and created before I entertain the idea of surrender. Yeah.
Yeah.
Does that
And
make
it is
sense?
that piece of kind of, what you mentioned about anger kind of being, people leaning into their anger. I also think that one of the reasons that this is so kind of omnipresent right now is that sometimes anger is a secondary emotion. Like sometimes
Mhm.
it's far easier to feel anger than it is, fear or grief or,
Mhm.
sadness or any of these other things. So I think that we get into these places where what people are doing is constantly leaning into anger because anger feels safer than sadness.
Ah, this is a very good point. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Very true. Yeah. So I think I mean, whenever anger is showing up, I think it's so important to pause and deeply listen. Like it's there for a reason. And for me, it's trying to get your attention, like
Yeah,
that's kind of the first thing. It's like, what needs to be tended to?
right. Or where do I need to set a boundary? That's usually,
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And so for myself, when I'm feeling angry, my practice is to stop and maybe do some journaling around that. So I always first check in with boundaries, like what's been violated. And sometimes, and very often it's integrity, right? It's like someone's
yeah.
asking you to do something that doesn't sit well with you because it feels like it's out of your integrity. And so that makes us angry, right? But as
Mm-hmm.
soon as I recognize that it's not in my integrity, I can land and make a conscious choice about what I want to do next. Maybe I'm not going to participate. Maybe I'm going to suggest an alternative, what have you. So the anger is there not so that I can necessarily start a fight. I mean, again, sometimes conflict is necessary and healthy, but in many situations, like when you're talking about, maybe anger being secondary or what have you, it's like if you pause and reflect and get the message first, very often you'll be out of that kind of really heightened state, so that again you can come up with a clear plan for what you want to do next and for what the next moves are in a way that's going to actually be supportive of your well-being.
Right, right. Yeah. I mean, it's almost like just a little red flag that pops up, and kind of for me is like, oh, you need to stop and look at something. What's really going on here?
Hmm.
So when you work with women that are trying to reclaim their power,
Mm-hmm.
like what advice would you give someone who wanted to just like take a baby step toward that process?
Mm-hmm. Baby step. Do something you want to do. This is going to sound like the most basic advice ever, but to be totally honest, it's literally like if there's something you've been wanting to do and or like dreaming of doing and you just keep putting it off because you think, oh, I'll do it when things calm down, I'll do it when I have time, and then you've noticed that like 5 years have gone by and oh look, you never have time because you're busy taking care of everyone else and everything else. Doesn't matter how small it is, literally doing something, anything for yourself that you want to do is a great way to reconnect with that sense of follow through. So it's funny, like I say this with the full knowledge that this could very quickly sound like a very trite piece of self-care advice around like, you do you, or like, just go get a manicure, but like, and those things are great and fine if that's what you need to
Sure.
do, that's what
Yeah.
you want to do, that could be the thing that you choose. Awesome. But the reason that it's deeper than that is because if you've been in a pattern, if you've been living if you've been trying to live on leftovers essentially, and never factoring your own needs into your lifestyle, then any amount that you can interrupt that pattern is going to start to strengthen your ability to do it more often and in bigger ways. So it's not so much about the thing that you choose to do. It's literally about making the choice to follow through on something that is outside of your typical habit pattern that you've become so accustomed to.
That makes total sense. And okay, so you just kind of led me to my next question here. You said something about living on leftovers, and I know that's on your website too. Tell me what that means.
Yeah. So, I mean, I see it all the time. It's like women who have no time or energy. You feel like your schedule is not your own because you're constantly saying yes to everything, because saying no would mean that you'd feel guilty or it would be awkward or you would feel bad because the other person would be disappointed and you don't want to deal with that weirdness. And so, then everything kind of falls on you. And of course, when you're in that situation, where do your priorities go? They fall right off the list. It's like, oh, well, I can do that later. That's always the thing that gets shoved off, right? So when you've been doing this for a long time, like if it's been a number of years, I've actually met so many women who have difficulty naming their needs in the first place anymore. It's like even recognizing that you have needs in the first place, and secondly, being curious about what those might be, and then how to actually advocate for them. Like, how do you put them onto your schedule? How do you articulate it to somebody with whom you're in a relationship when you've never done it? You've been together for 10 years, all those sorts of things. So what it means to me, this idea of not living on leftovers anymore, is about cultivating healthy boundaries. It's about learning how to say no without feeling weird about it.
Mm-hmm.
It's about identifying your needs and speaking up and factoring them into the plans, right? I think it really does start there. And so that's why I talk so much about self-regulation in the context of personal development, because in order to do the courageous thing that you haven't done before, it's like we need the ability to find a sense of like a neutral place, or to get out of our fight or flight response, right?
Yes.
So it's not because I think you should be calm. It's because literally, in order for the part of our brain that can think clearly and solve problems and make plans, in order for that part of the brain to be firing on all cylinders, we can't be in our fight or flight.
Yeah, we can't be in the lizard brain. We have to be
right?
the full deal.
Yeah. So when you're in your stress response, when you're in your fight or flight, that's when it's all like heightened emotions. You act on autopilot. You do what comes most easily. And so you're probably not going to take the steps to change your life when you're living in that fight or flight space. And so the very idea of cultivating healthy boundaries, of saying no to somebody, can provoke that fight or flight right away. Like, I'm sure some listeners right now might be thinking, like, imagining themselves saying no, where they deep down they've wanted to say no, but they haven't done it yet. It's like, if you even just imagine doing that, I see it all the time with my clients, that stress response comes up, right?
And I think that's a really good point, right? Because I think when people think about fight or flight, they think about being in an actual, like, physically threatening situation or in an argument or something. But the fact is, for a lot of people, just like going there in your imagination is enough to provoke that response. Just
Absolutely.
thinking about, and I mean, I think, it's like some degree, it's kind of catastrophizing, and in some degrees it's kind of just like letting your brain go to everything that could go wrong, and you get into that sort of, which is essentially the same thing, but like where you get into that sort of response even if nothing's actually happened.
Yeah, it's so true. You start spinning out, right?
And sometimes we don't even think all that out in words. It can just be a feeling, like for
absolutely.
people who will just get like an anxiety response physically in a situation where they're not sure why it's happening. Like sometimes, the brain is an interesting thing, and things can trigger us, and we can go to places without really realizing what it is that took us there.
Yeah, absolutely. Because that mind-body connection goes both ways, right? It's like we might have a thought that makes us feel a certain way, but also based on our life experiences, we can take in our environment and it will create a feeling state in the body related to our nervous system. And then our mind will fill in the blanks and often try to reason as to why we're feeling so panicky or what have you. But sometimes it will be based on just stuff that you've been through in your life. So that's why I'm a huge believer in like the external work as well as the internal work. It's like, if you can learn to come into a healthy relationship with your own body, to really understand your own stress response, and to learn the tools that work best for you in order to regulate your nervous system, then you're going to have the capacity to show up boldly. You're going to have the capacity not only to take care of yourself when things go sideways and you're kind of, you're in a rough period, but also when you're being called to step up in your life, when you're being called to do something bigger and outside your comfort zone. It's those very same skills that are going to help you to get out of your stress response when you're doing the bold thing so that you can actually do it. Right. Yeah. So I love how those resilience skills, they apply equally. Like these are skills that I learned when I was experiencing anxiety and depression about 15 years ago. And they're the same tools that I use now when like I'm feeling pretty good, but I want to do like a new thing. Like, launch a podcast or speak on a stage in front of hundreds of people. You know what I mean? Yeah, so that's that inner work and leveraging the mind body connection to be able to show up and verbalize your healthy boundaries and take the bold, courageous actions that you need to take in order to follow through on your dreams.
Yeah. And it's funny when you describe the not living on leftovers, it seems like really what you're talking about is living a life where you're human first. Like you're a human being and you get to think about yourself and your wants and your needs, because that's the baseline, right?
Yeah.
And then you can choose if you want to take on things for other people. But I think we get that reversed a lot as women.
Absolutely, we do. And like, don't you, just as much as anybody else, deserve to have your needs met? It's not about being more important than other people. And I think that's also why we resist it, right? It's this, and it's similar to the power thing. It's like, well, we think that if we're saying yes to ourselves, that means that we don't value other people, or, that we're neglecting other responsibilities and that sort of thing. But like, don't I count just as much as the person next to me? Like, I don't have to think that I count more than them in order to put my needs on the list.
Well, and you don't expect, I find very few women who expect someone else to put their needs first.
Oh yeah.
So if you're not doing it and you don't expect, nobody else is doing it either, where do your needs come in? And I think that's why we get in these situations where, you said a lot of times you feel like your clients don't even know what they want or need because they've so lost touch with that. And I find that question of what do you really need or what do you really want is one of those questions that it's probably the question that is most likely to cause someone to burst into tears. When they realize oh my God, I haven't thought about that in so long. I don't even know where to start.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a powerful one.
It's very true. And the other, as you were describing that, I totally get how that could be powerful enough to bring someone to tears. And then on the other hand, a lot of people deflect it with humor. Like, how many times have I asked someone, what, if something could change, what would it be? It's like, oh, well, I would win the lottery and have a private chef and, that sort of thing.
And I think that's one of the big differences between a social situation and a coaching session.
Yeah.
Because they know when we're asking it, we mean it,
Absolutely.
We're not just being polite.
Yeah. But how cool would it be if in social situations as well, women started to say, to be honest about something realistic that would actually make a difference in their lives,
Yeah.
I think that would be amazing, because then we would contribute, we'd be culture makers. We'd be contributing to a culture where it's normal for women to have needs and to name them.
Absolutely. Imagine what that would look like. And I do always think that it's such a powerful thing when I see a woman in a collective situation, whether it's at work or socially, verbally set a boundary or verbally state a need. That's a powerful thing for every other woman in the room.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's why I love watching YouTube videos. Who was it? Maxine Waters. I'm Reclaiming My Time.
Yes.
Yeah. So watch it, just watching some videos like that of people that are really owning it, and being like, I'm in charge right now. This is what's happening. And Elizabeth Warren, oh my God, if you want to see a woman who is very clear on her boundaries and what shit she will and will not take.
Yep. And that's so important for us to see that, and to see people that aren't perpetuating the myths.
Yeah.
That are talking about what's real.
Yeah, it's very powerful stuff for sure. For sure.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and talking about all this great stuff today. I really think these things are just so, important, and everybody needs to talk about them, kind of more. And I want to ask you one last question, and this is another one that I ask everybody, but what would you like for the audience to know that you think might surprise them about the work you do?
About the work I do. Well, this is a good one. I have to think about it for a second. I'm feeling a little bit stumped right now. Something that would surprise them about the work that I do. That's a very good question.
Or maybe what surprises the people you work with the most when they're doing the work?
So it's interesting because often people will show up thinking that they need more discipline, for instance. Yeah, this is it. This is what I want to say. I know that was a long pause to think, but I take questions very seriously. So they often show up thinking that they need more willpower or more discipline. So common. And then we go through the first coaching session. They're like, whoa. I keep thinking that I needed more willpower or discipline, but what I discovered is that there's something entirely different that I want for myself. And the stuff I've been pressuring myself to get better at doing really doesn't matter to me.
Wow. Yeah.
So I hesitate a bit to say that, like, in this context, or I should say out of a coaching context, because, it's best grounded in a real life situation. But, so often women do just feel overwhelmed and like their schedules are really crazy and I just have to get better at this. I have to be more productive. But again, it's like the shift that you described around like internal oppression and recognizing that maybe cracking the whip on yourself is just a form of limiting yourself even more, when perhaps there's something more fulfilling that if you focused on that, everything else would fall into place. And the things that you think you're supposed to be focusing on right now might matter less, or else will be easier to do, or you'll find another way. So it's really magical. And it's funny because, it surprises me too. I don't have the answer. I'm not the one telling people, what the thing is, as you know, Jen, as a coach, but through the process, it's just something that's under the surface waiting to come up to be discovered. So it's a really beautiful thing. You don't need to know what you want to get started.
I think that's a big one.
It's something that will reveal itself to you, but it's like when you create the space for yourself to start to explore. And then of course, when you've got the amazing guidance of great coaching questions as well, then that's when the truth will come up. It's not something that you just figure out with your head. It's really organic and needs room to breathe.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think all of this type of work is really sort of organic. You never know quite where it's going to go, but it always sort of goes where it's meant to.
Absolutely.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. I'm so glad that you came on, and I would love to have you back again to talk more about all this stuff.
Amazing. I would love to come back. I love chatting with you. I feel like every time we talk, we could just keep going. I know.
So
good. Thank you so much for having me on, Jen. It's been awesome.